Hey, I get it. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. I'm all for borrowing ideas, sharing what works and what doesn't. But when you're content to do what you've always done or to rely on what works for other organizations, you miss the opportunity to discover what will actually work for you. That's why you'll hardly, if ever, hear me recommend so-called best practices. I know, referring to best practices sounds so professional. If you know whether something is a best practice or not, you really seem like an expert. It's so insider. And like I said, there is a place for knowledge sharing and recognizing what types of activities have a high probability of working. But there's something much more important to you and to your organization than best practices. Today, we're talking about what actually works for your organization, for your members and donors, for your audience and followers. It requires trust, patience, and a little bit of bravery. And if you've got all that, and I bet you do, then you've come to the right episode. Welcome to Profitable Nonprofits. I'm Bernadette Mack, and I help nonprofit leaders just like you build sustainable, thriving organizations without the burnout. If you're tired of constantly chasing donations, or you struggle with engagement, or you're wondering how to make a bigger impact, well, you're in the right place. Each week, we tackle real nonprofit challenges with practical, no-fluff strategies that you can apply right away. You're doing all the hard work, so now let's make it a little easier. We nonprofit workers love to talk about best practices, don't we? But what if I told you that relying too much on best practices could actually be holding your organization back? Today, I'm going to break down why you'll never hear me use that phrase and what you should focus on instead to grow a stronger, more strategic nonprofit. Maybe you're thinking, hey, what's the problem with best practices? After all, a lot of best practices do make up our structures, policies, and procedures. It's a best practice to have updated bylaws, to record your meeting minutes, and to follow sound financial procedures. These types of activities are what give your organization structure, integrity, and credibility. And these types of best practices are ingrained in everything we do. They're not up for debate. They are the standard that every nonprofit should adhere to. But these are not the best practices that I'm referring to. The best practices I'm talking about today relate mostly to marketing, communication, and fundraising strategy and the trends that come and go. Usually, they come and go with pricey software packages or some new service that your organization simply must try. But what I want you to hear today is that adopting best practices can lead to stagnation, or worse, can backfire completely, especially if they don't actually fit your organization's unique situation. When we come back, I'll share with you a real-world example of an epic failure due to sticking with best practices instead of tailoring efforts to fit a specific problem. All right, so what happened? Well, in January of 2010, a 7.0 magnitude earthquake struck Haiti near the capital of Port-au-Prince. And after the devastating earthquake, the American Red Cross raised nearly $500 million in donations. And this was largely due to a best practice fundraising strategy, high urgency appeals, mobile giving campaigns like text to give, and leveraging their well-established brand. On the surface, this looked like a huge success. This disaster triggered one of the largest international humanitarian responses in history, but it also highlighted major failures in aid distribution and long-term recovery efforts. Instead of adapting their response to the specific needs on the ground, the Red Cross applied a one-size-fits-all disaster response model, and this was a typical best practice for large-scale emergency aid. However, this led to several problems. One was a lack of local expertise. They tried to run operations without having any deep partners in Haiti, and that led to a lot of logistical failures and cultural just misunderstandings. Next, they had a misallocation of funds. The organization promised to build thousands of homes, but only 6 permanent homes were ever built. Bureaucratic inefficiencies, lack of clear oversight, and a top-down decision-making model meant that much of the money never actually directly benefited Haitian communities. They also had an over-reliance on volunteers and generalist staff. They sent in a disaster response teams that were trained in broad emergency relief, but they lacked experience in Haiti's infrastructure challenges, which led to slow and ineffective rebuilding efforts. Finally, there was a failure to adapt to on-the-ground needs. Many survivors needed housing, healthcare, and local economic support. Instead, the Red Cross followed its traditional model, focusing on distributing relief supplies rather than addressing long-term recovery. So, what do we take away from this terrible lesson? Because this case is like a cautionary tale about the danger of blindly following best practices without adapting to real-world conditions. Best practices are meant to be a starting point, not a rigid rule book. In the Red Cross's case, a more effective approach would have involved having stronger local partnerships with organizations in Haiti, having more transparent fund allocation and impact measurement, and having a needs-based rather than a top-down approach to relief efforts. And this is a powerful example for nonprofits to remember that best practices should be a guide, not a substitute for critical thinking and local expertise. Now, this is a very extreme, large-scale case of blindly sticking with best practices instead of using sound principles to create a specific plan that works. But here's a much smaller scale example and much more positive. I have a client that sends out an 8-page newsletter every quarter. It's called the Quarterly Newsletter. And it's filled with stories and images from the organization as well as from other contributors. It's very well done. And it's also printed and mailed, like as in postal mail. So now best practices would say that newsletters should be digital in this day and age. The cost of printing and postage just cannot be justified in 2025, especially for a large publication like that. I mean, 8 pages, it's not 1 page in a little envelope. But luckily, my client, who is a historical society and a museum and a library, doesn't listen to best practices when it comes to this newsletter. They know that their membership demographic, which is predominantly 65 and up, places a high value on receiving this printed piece every quarter. It's considered a big part of their membership benefits. If this client were to take away their newsletter or take away the paper version simply because 95% of organizations have gone digital with theirs, that would be a huge mistake, at least for right now. Even when I started working with them as a client, one of my first questions was, tell me why you continue to send a paper newsletter. It didn't take long for me to realize that it was an important part of their value to members and that this organization had a really strong sense for who their members are and what they want from the organization. Every nonprofit is different. Mission, size, geographic location, donor base, funding model, staff capacity, and what works for one organization might be completely wrong for another. And best practices, quote unquote, often ignore the nuances of your organization's unique challenges and strengths. When we come back, we're going to talk about what to do instead. Hey, nonprofit leaders, does your mission statement actually inspire action? Or is it an old relic filled with nonprofit jargon and cliches? If you're looking to craft a mission, vision, and value statement that truly connects with donors, volunteers, and stakeholders, I've got the perfect resource for you. My Mission Workbook is a DIY guide designed to help you and your team clarify your purpose, align your messaging, and create statements that fuel real impact. Stop talking around what you do and start connecting your mission with donors and members. Everything, and I do mean everything, starts with a well-written mission statement. Grab your copy today at BernadetteMac.com under Resources. All right, so if we're not going to rely on best practices and, go out and Google what's the best practice for X, Y, and Z, then what are we supposed to do? Well, we have to think about focusing on guiding principles rather than copy and pasting solutions. Instead of asking, what's the best practice for this? We should ask better questions like, what's the goal we're trying to achieve? What are the actual challenges in our organization? What solutions have worked for organizations like ours with similar constraints? This is what I want you to take away from this week's episode, if nothing else. Instead of relying on best practices, I want you to test, measure, and adapt. Implement strategies based on data, not assumptions or not things that work in other places. I know you probably have a lot of experience, intuition about what works and what doesn't if you've been around for a while, if you're a seasoned nonprofit executive. But oftentimes, especially today, what we think is going to work or what we see working other places, when we look at the data, it just often isn't true. And here's a little bit of real talk on this subject. A lot of times in nonprofits, we are hyper-focused on good outcomes. Nothing else is an option. And we're trying to reach our goals no matter what. And because of that, we don't allow ourselves the freedom to test and to try new methods. It's like whatever worked in the past, we're just doing it again. We can't afford to take a chance and try something new. We're not allowed to have something fall flat. Every single thing we send out feels like the world is hinging on it. I mean, at least that's how I've felt in the past. And if that's you too, then I just don't want you to feel this way. I want you to cut yourself some slack and make it clear to your team and to your board that you're dedicated and talented enough to be able to take a few calculated risks from time to time and just see, could there be a better way? We need to stop being so precious about every process and every email and every letter and include some freedom to test new methods. Could this work for our organization? Well, there's only one way to find out. Give it a try. If you're being limited by a manager or a board that won't accept anything but best practices, then it's time to have a tough conversation about the risks they're taking by standing still in an ever-changing world. Or if you hide behind best practices as a way to cover your ass, oh, that didn't work? Well, it wasn't my idea. It's best practices. We're, just following best practices. Instead of owning your own ideas and your own experiences and what you see in your own data. This is not to say that you should throw caution to the wind and run around trying new things willy-nilly. That doesn't work either. You should be thoughtful and methodical in your testing. The idea here is to not take for granted that all best practices are what you should be doing. But there are times when industry standards and compliance rules make best practices unavoidable, like, for financial accountability, legal requirements, nonprofit governance, things like that. The key is customization, using best practices as a starting point, not a rule book, and not the only option. This week, I want you to go ahead and take a look at one best practice that you've been following in your nonprofit and ask yourself, is this really serving us? Or is it just something we've always done? If it's not working, it's time to rethink. I would love it if you send me a message or leave me a voicemail at 914-297-7692 because I'd love to hear about best practices and if they're working for you, if there are any that you really feel like it's time to change. Give me a call, let me know. And remember, just because something is common and, maybe works for a bunch of other people, it doesn't mean it's right for you. You've got to keep questioning, keep innovating, and keep leading with strategy, not just tradition. Thanks for tuning in to Profitable Nonprofits. If you found this episode helpful, be sure to subscribe so you never miss a new one. Also, consider providing a 5-star rating and help more nonprofit leaders find the show. For more resources and strategies to grow your nonprofit, visit BernadetteMac.com. And if you have a question or a topic you'd love me to cover, send me a message or leave me a voicemail at 914-297-7692. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep up the good work. And remember, running a nonprofit is tough, but you're tougher.